we will always desperately want from other people what we fear God will not provide for us.
Give some examples of that.
Well, if we're in a relationship and we fear that that person may be disappointed in us, that they may take their acceptance away, that's a tough one, right? But chances are, if that person, if you're worried about that person being so disappointed in you and not accepting you because you draw a healthy boundary, chances are that's the kind of person who's going to reject you eventually anyways, whether or not you draw healthy boundaries.
Yeah, that's good.
So how did you start that journey in your marriage? Because you're seeing that in your marriage and you're tolerating it for, what, decades?
Yeah, decades.
Yeah.
And
Which I'm going to add too, Dave. It feels, as a Christian woman walking with Jesus, it feels like that's what we're supposed to do. Aren't we supposed to love them unconditionally? And so that's that fine line.
yes, what I didn't realize is that we can love unconditionally, but access that we grant people needs to be very dependent on whether or not they are being responsible with that access. You know, Jesus did absolutely lay down his life, and he modeled for us to lay down our life. But Jesus laid down his life for a high and holy purpose. He did not lay down his life to enable bad behavior to continue.
So you got to a point where you realized you were doing that, or?
Yeah, and I think it wasn't just, with my previous marriage. It was in a lot of relationships because I just wanted to try to keep the peace. But what I realized is that in doing so, I was losing the best of who I was.
I had heard you share a previous time that you were a room mom. And this teacher asked you to come back. After your child was out of her class, she asked you to come back and do a party?
Yes, and help with the party for the grade that my kids were no longer in. And I remember at first, see, this is where my tendency is. A request is made, and suddenly I feel like it's my obligation.
Yes.
And so in years past, in many relationships, I would think every request is now my responsibility. And I realized one day, no, it's not my responsibility because we have limited capacity. And I was walking around acting as if I had unlimited capacity, unlimited physical capacity, unlimited emotional, mental, spiritual capacity, just like I was just acting like I'm limited. And when we do that, we're trying to put ourselves in a position to be the ultimate provider for other people, and that should only be God's job. And honestly, I was flattered that she wanted me to do the party, but I had to ask myself, do I really have the white space? Because what will happen is I'll sign up for it now, and then as it gets closer and closer and closer, I will be so stressed out, my family gets the worst of who I am.
And I would say to myself, why did I ever say yes to this?
Exactly.
And you're crazy. You become crazy. And yeah, your family pays for it.
That's right. And so I now ask myself to be honest about reality. Mental health is a commitment to reality at all costs. And so if we are committed to reality, then we have to be honest with ourselves. We have to be self-aware enough to know what our limitations are. And it's not because we're selfish. Now, certainly, if our motivation is a selfish motivation, we need to check our heart. But most of the time, our motivation, or at least mine was, I just want peace, And so I would rather pay the price than disrupt the peace. But you can only pay the price so long before you can become bankrupted. Just like we have limited funds in our bank account, and everybody's pretty good about drawing boundaries around their bank account. Most of us have, a passcode. I'm not saying you remember the passcode, but I'm just saying most of us have a passcode, right?
Yeah.
And we're not going to, on the air today, suddenly give all people all access to our limited funds. We know not to do that, and it's responsible. It's not mean or unchristian to limit people's access to our bank account. We know it with that area of our life, but sometimes we miss it with so many other areas of limited capacity.
I thought the way that you responded to her and said no was genius. I've even already used it with someone.
Me?
No, I used it with one of our sons. Like, this is how you could do it.
Yeah, so I always want to be true to my heart because my heart does say, yes, yes. I really would love to do that. So my response was, while my heart says yes, 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 the reality of my time makes this a no. Thank you for understanding.
So how do you
Without over explaining.
I know. I almost added that part because this is where the voice of Jim Kress, my counselor, comes in, and he reminds me, adults inform, children explain. And I'm like, okay, but can there be a hybrid in the middle? Like, can I just do a little tiny explanation, And so, yeah, I'm working on that
Now,
too.
what's wrong
Thanks
with-
for bringing up that issue. I got so many issues. That's why, I write these books.
No, I was relating to it because I thought the same thing. And then what I tend to do is I over-explain why I can't do it.
Yes.
And it's not necessary.
Why do we over-explain? Why do we explain at all?
I think we're almost trying to get the other person to sign on to our boundary.
That's it.
So that we don't have the awkward tension of them not being on the same page with us. And so we're trying to manage their feelings, which is also something that I'm continuing to work on. It's not my job to manage someone else's feelings. My job is to inform them what is and is not okay, what is and is not acceptable, what I do and do not have to give. And I think that's really the purest definition of a boundary. A boundary is an effective communication tool for us to establish what is and is not okay, what we will and will not accept, and what we do and do not have to give. Always checking our heart to make sure we're not being selfish, but at the same time being honest so that we can keep the best of who we are front and center and actually look like we spent some time with Jesus. It's like when I get pushed past my capacity and I'm feeling bankrupted in the emotional area of my life, then I'm not going to stay self-controlled. I'm going to eventually lose it in some capacity. And it is not my responsibility to control other people. But biblically speaking, it's evidence of God's Spirit in me when I demonstrate self-control.
I mean, think about sorry, I keep cutting you off. Go ahead.
This is great. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No.
I was just going to say, like,
I'm
if
setting a boundary. Go ahead.
if you think about the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, even those, when I look at
Exactly.
my life, let alone self-control, that should give me an indication. And this is just, anyway, I think that really does give us an indication if we're walking in the Spirit or if we're just trying to please others. Go ahead.
Yeah, my thought was if I'm listening and I don't know if I need to set a boundary, how do I identify? Like, other people can see it, I can't see it. How do I know I need to be better at boundaries?
Where there's chaos, there is a lack of a boundary. So I always tell people, look for the chaos in your life. And wherever there's chaos, it could be relational chaos, it could be time chaos, it could be financial chaos. Look for the chaos in your life. And there you'll find the need for a healthy boundary. And, my big question when I started this whole process is God okay with boundaries?
Right.
And so I sat down with my theologian in residence, Joel Muddamalle, who's amazing. He's actually Dr. Joel now. He's since gotten his doctorate. But we sat down and we started in Genesis. And right from the very beginning, when God is establishing the foundation of the world, He has boundaries. He separates light from darkness. They work together to form a 24-hour period, but there is a separation where one stops and another begins. That's called a boundary. He told the water, you can come this far, but no further. That's a boundary, right? And so then I got over to Genesis chapter 2, and I was even more astounded. The very first recorded conversation between God and man. Think of all the topics God could have chosen for this first recorded conversation. And God chooses a topic of a boundary. And the way God establishes the boundary with Adam is very interesting. He says, you are free. So he establishes the boundary lines so that we know where real freedom exists. He said, you're free to eat from any tree in the garden. So plenty of provision inside the boundary. It's not like he's being overly restrictive, and it's for the sake of freedom. And then he says, but you must not eat from this one tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And then there's a consequence, because my counselor Jim Kress also taught me a boundary without a consequence is nothing but a mere suggestion. And so we see right from the first recorded conversation between God and man that there was a boundary established. And in Genesis 2, there's one rule. Then, of course, Genesis 3 happens, sin enters in, and what does sin bring? Chaos. And where there's chaos, there's a need for more boundaries. As sin increased, chaos increased, and by the time we get in the Bible to the law and the prophets, there are over 600 boundaries. Why? Because, like I was saying to you before, you want to know where a boundary is needed in your life, look for the chaos. Where there's chaos, where there's sin, there's chaos, and where there's chaos, there's a need for a boundary.